You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 386, recorded on Sunday, July 4th, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho is Rachel. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
So before we get started, one note. Last week we had to unexpectedly push our quarterly break up 1 week. We should get into today's topic, which should have been covered a couple weeks ago, but again, got pushed to today. And this is the 50th anniversary of the Albuquerque Rebellion, which was on June 15th, 1971. So a few weeks ago was the 50th anniversary, and it was the Albuquerque Rebellion, or the riot in Roosevelt Park. There was a violent police crackdown on people in a public park, which triggered widespread unrest and some arson, followed by mass arrests and a National Guard deployment and a state investigation into the abuses of the Albuquerque Police Department. In this episode, we'll talk about what happened, some of the factors leading to the events of 50 years ago, and some of the situation in Albuquerque today. So to start off, we will take a look at the KUNM radio report that was posted this week, but included both a summary of what happened from today's perspective as well as actual audio clips from June of 1971. So, Rachel, what was the basic summary here of what happened in the middle of June of 1971?
So it began on June 13th, 1971, after a young Chicano Mexican-American man was reportedly arrested for selling a joint to an undercover narcotics agent. And the situation quickly escalated out of control, and the Black Berets, which was a Chicano community organization, were called in to try to move people out of the park and to speak with police about the historical abuses against the Chicano community on the part of the police, but they were fired upon by the police. And this blew up into a riot, which was fueled by these decades of racism and police abuse against Albuquerque's Chicano community. And like we mentioned, the National Guard was brought in. So the KUNM radio did cover it. There was some contemporary clips of the time, and they recently re-aired the audio recorded and aired in 1971. So one figure whose voice was aired from a rally after the incident used an interesting phrase that struck out to 21st century listeners in Albuquerque for both its honesty and its ongoing applicability to the present day. Quote, "What they may call alleged, but we know are actual acts of brutality by the notorious Albuquerque Police Department," end quote. And another speaker representing the Black Berets group elaborated on this point, quote, "Back in December, Las Gorras Negras confronted the city commission. Our people are being harassed, brutalized, and murdered. The city commission could give a damn. So when we went into a community patrol, trying to talk to the pigs on an individual basis, trying to cut down on harassment and brutality by just our presence there. We were armed because one of our brothers had been murdered, Bobby Garcia." So there had been a lot of tensions brewing, and they just kind of exploded out of control in June.
Now, I thought it was interesting that they were willing to just air those quotes at the time in 1971 on KUNM. But Rachel, you also took a look at a contemporary article from the Albuquerque Journal, and you found that was also pretty even-handed, surprisingly.
Yeah, it was a very extensive feature-length article. It recounted the overnight going into 2 days account. They weren't really afraid to point out the overzealous use of nightsticks on the protesters, and that the actions on the part of the police did spur the onlookers to protest the use of force. It also really challenged the law enforcement's narrative of events, which is kind of what people accuse local news media of just being stenographers for the police today. So they pointed out that when objects were thrown at police cars, the cops responded violently and non-proportionally. And also they pointed out that cops used mace against the bystanders, which was an account that the cops were kind of protesting against. So some of the details from the KUNM account are missing in this timeline, such as the arrest for selling marijuana to a narcotics officer. According to the Albuquerque Journal account, the instigating event was the bust-up of youths drinking beer in the park. And it's pretty clear from this account, this version, that the cops are really choosing to escalate events by their disproportionate reaction to what I would call youthful indiscretions. Like, you youths drinking beer in a park is a pretty minor offense. It doesn't really require even arresting the offenders. You could just ticket them, you could just cite them. They really chose to create this situation by choosing to arrest the offenders in the park. The article mentioned TV footage being recorded from KOB TV that shows cops using, quote, considerable force, perhaps justified, perhaps not, in making arrests and subduing suspects, unquote. And the article kind of points out a narrative that people have pointed out in modern day riots and civil unrest. They pointed out that it appeared to be white people agitating and starting a lot of the violent, like arson, property destruction, looting, in reaction to the cops' brutality. And they were pointing out that the Latino community leaders were attempting to participate in the talks with the authorities at the police station to discuss grievances. So that's kind of a modern day reflection of what we saw over the past summer, where it appeared to be like white people destroying property, looting, whereas the Black people were trying to discuss their grievances, discuss what was happening, talk about the history of police brutality in their communities. So it was kind of an interesting connection to be made between these events from 50 years ago to the events that are happening more recently.
Yeah, and like you said, when we talk about the coverage today, there's often accusations that, they're stenographers for the cops and they're just reporting the accounts that the police have and so forth. And as we've also talked about on the show, while in this case the local coverage by the newspaper in Albuquerque was fine, the coverage from the New York Times of basically anything along these lines has always been pretty terrible, and it continues to be quite terrible. You can look at their coverage of the stuff that happened in Ferguson in 2014 and Michael Brown and things like that, and just horrible coverage by the New York Times. And so I, of course, went to look to see what they had said in 1971, 50 years ago when this happened. And the coverage was typical of the New York Times in being, at best, weird and at worst, actively unhelpful, untrue, racist, pro-powers that be, etc. That being said, I thought there was some interesting analysis included in that article, so I wanted to take a look at that. So here's one quote. In the aftermath of the violence, city officials asked why. They asked the question of one another, refusing invitations from the city's leading militant group, the Black Berets, to meet and discuss the cause and effect. The Black Berets, a brown power movement with some Negro membership, said they felt that they had been shouting into a vacuum warnings about unemployment, frustration, and what they see as racism and police brutality. So, like I said, typical weird coverage from the New York Times, but still like pointing out something obvious there, which is that a bunch of city officials were like looking at each other and going, well, why is this happening? And every time that the community leaders from some of these more radical militant community representation groups from ethnic minorities, or I should say from ethnic non-whites, because in the case of New Mexico, generally we're not talking about minorities, that was something that they were just completely ignoring. They didn't have any interest in that. So speaking of demographics, there had been a significant demographic shift in the decades leading up to 1971 in New Mexico as a whole, but also in the general area of places like Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and so forth. A lot of that had to do with the Los Alamos project. And there was some information both in the New York Times about this, as well as some things that I found in some other articles that I looked at, such as the Wikipedia article for this incident. They noted in the Wikipedia article that Roosevelt Park had been a New Deal project, and according to the New York Times, it was built shortly before the federal government became a major employer in Albuquerque. and a wave of new, predominantly white people moved there to work for or support the nuclear weapons research project. So here's some information on the park itself from the Wikipedia summary. Although one of Albuquerque's most popular gathering places, Roosevelt Park developed a reputation as a dangerous area during the 1960s and 70s with numerous violent incidents as well as ongoing issues with drug use and underage drinking. Nearby residents petitioned for improved lighting and a curfew in 1965, citing nighttime disturbances ranging from shouts to screaming and calls for help. The ongoing trouble at Roosevelt Park and other city parks led the Albuquerque Police Department to establish an undercover park patrol unit in the late 1960s. Relations between the police and park goers were tense, leading to incidents of rock throwing and finally a full-blown riot in 1971 after police tried to arrest some teenagers for drinking beer in the park. The riot spread across the city, ultimately causing over $3 million in damage and 41 injuries. But by 1971, a federal anti-poverty worker said that the unemployment rate among the Mexican, and this is from the New York Times article again, among the Mexican Spanish community in their late teens and early 20s is more than 20% in Albuquerque. About half of the city's Mexican and Spanish families are considered to be poverty-stricken. So you can see that there's this ongoing challenge of just severe poverty, underemployment, etc. And according to the New York Times, again, there had been this huge demographic shift after that New Deal period when the Los Alamos project started in the area, and you get all these white federal workers coming in. Quote, the city's culture also changed drastically. It has been transformed from Spanish to Anglo. Albuquerque, which was 100% Indian, Mexican, and Spanish, is now 75% Anglo. All of New Mexico has developed similarly. So I guess that gets back to the point that I mentioned earlier, which is like, are these ethnic minorities or just not because they're not minority? In this case, they had become pushed into the minority, and the result of this was that they were this sort of very severe underclass that was being brutalized by the police. There had also been a ethno-religious insurrection a few years before the 1971 riots in the area. This was in 1967, and it was led by this sort of ethno-religious type preacher guy. Like, I don't know if you would call him a charismatic preacher or what, but he had also, the New York Times referred to it as a Brown Power violence incident or case. He's a fundamentalist Protestant preacher from Texas called Reyes Tijerina, and he, quote, led an uprising of the desperately poor in northern New Mexico. Tijerina's men seized a whole county, contending that the land was theirs because it had been stolen from trusting Mexican, Spanish, and Indian settlers by immigrating Anglos. And he was in prison and due out about a month after the 1971 incident. I'm not sure what happened after that. I assume he was released. And the metaphorical fire that he started in 1967 had not gone out, and the National Guard had been called in against that incident as well. So you can see that this did not come out of nowhere in 1971 in Albuquerque. This was part of a broader situation that was unfolding. There had also been the previous year campus clashes at University of New Mexico, Albuquerque. Folks may remember, if they weren't old enough to have actually lived through it, they probably have read about it, that there were significant campus protests across the country in 1970, especially after the Kent State shooting. But of course, the Kent State shooting followed the existing wave of campus protests, a lot of those having to do with the Vietnam War, the actions in Cambodia by the U.S. government, and so on and so forth. And so, again, just some additional context that led up to this incident in 1971. Unsurprisingly, according to the New York Times, local authorities used the classic line they blamed, quote, out-of-state agitators, but the New York Times acknowledged that very few people arrested were from out-of-state, and clearly most of the people involved were upset about local issues. Quote, the Municipal State Supreme Court issued a statement saying that the police had nothing to fear from the courts for reasonable actions taken to quell civil disturbances. Almost none of the 500 persons arrested on Sunday and Monday were tried this week. The trials had been scheduled for Thursday, but they were postponed for 10 days. There was some difficulty in arranging attorneys for the accused, and judges said they wanted to allow time for the situation to cool off. So the courts were pretty willing to back up the police on what was clearly very vast overreaches and sweeping arrests. Now, Rachel, before we talk about the present day, I wanted to stop here and see if you had any thoughts on any of this.
Just to underline the UNM Albuquerque kind of connection to this escalation of violence, that June 15th Albuquerque Journal newspaper that I mentioned earlier, another article in that feature section did have a letter to the editor from a professor at UNM Albuquerque, just kind of decrying the crime, the youths overrunning Roosevelt Park. So it just kind of shows that there was this like upper middle class of white people that were really kind of marginalizing the people hanging out in Roosevelt Park. In the Albuquerque Journal, they did interview some of these Chicano youths, and they said they literally had nothing else to do. They didn't have money. They were most likely unemployed. There was this poverty in their community. So there was nothing else for them other than hanging out in the park, which put them at odds with these upper middle class white people that just saw them as like a criminal element. So it's easy to see where this like tension came from, and just how open the upper middle class white people were about how they saw these Chicano youths as just criminal, like potential criminals, basically.
So, as we said earlier, KUNM, the radio station right nearby this rebellion or riot in 1971, had that quote that they aired from one of these non-white speakers at the rally, talking about acts of brutality by the notorious Albuquerque Police Department. Now, I saw people who live in Albuquerque or the Albuquerque area commenting on the 50th anniversary that the Albuquerque Police Department is still notorious to present day. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about that. The Albuquerque Police Department has been under U.S. Department of Justice monitoring for years, with investigations launched in 2012 and a consent decree agreement reached in late 2014. Regular reports are still being published to the DOJ website as of this year, 2021. The investigations begun in 2012 are overseen by then Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division, Tom Perez, the future U.S. Labor Secretary and DNC chair. The investigation focused on, quote, allegations that APD officers engage in use of excessive force, including use of unreasonable deadly force in their encounters with civilians. In April 2014, the findings of that investigation were released. Quote, the Justice Department found a reasonable cause to believe that the Albuquerque Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of excessive force in violation of the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. The Justice Department specifically found 3 patterns of excessive force. Officers too frequently use deadly force against people who pose a minimal threat in situations where the conduct of the officers heightens the danger and contributes to the need to use force. Officers use less lethal force, including tasers, on people who are passively resisting, non-threatening, observably unable to comply with orders, or pose only a minimal threat to officers. And encounters between Albuquerque police officers and persons with mental illness and in crisis too frequently result in use of force or a higher level of force than necessary. The Justice Department also found systemic deficiencies of the police department, which contribute to these 3 patterns. The causes include deficient policies, failed accountability systems, inadequate training, inadequate supervision, ineffective systems of investigation and adjudication, the absence of a culture of community policing, and a lack of sufficient civilian oversight. Now, Rachel, in October of 2014, the U.S. Department of Justice and the City of Albuquerque reached a binding court agreement for police reforms, and I was hoping that you could read through some of the specific reforms that were required under this consent decree from the U.S. Department of Justice.
Yeah. So in October 2014, the U.S. DOJ and City of Albuquerque reached a binding court agreement for police reforms. Under the settlement agreement, the city and APD will implement comprehensive reforms in 9 substantive areas. An independent monitoring team will be selected jointly and will oversee the reforms, which are expected to be implemented within 4 years. The areas covered by the settlement agreement are use of force, including requiring supervisors to report to the scene of uses of force, providing medical care to subjects of force immediately after an incident, improving the quality of force investigations, developing a force review board to detect and correct patterns and trends, and utilizing surrounding law enforcement agencies as part of a multi-agency task force to investigate officer-involved shootings to provide greater objectivity and accountability. specialized units, including measures that require clearly defined missions and duties for specialized tactical and investigative units, ensuring that officers are sufficiently trained to save lives in high-risk situations, and dismantling APD's repeat offender project to restore its core mission as an investigative rather than tactical unit. Crisis intervention, including establishing a mental health response advisory committee, providing behavioral health training to all officers, police dispatchers, and 911 operators, and maintaining groups of specially trained first responders, detectives, and mental health professionals that provide crisis intervention and ongoing support to individuals with serious mental illness or who are chronically homeless. Policies and training, including developing clear and comprehensive policies on use of force, preventing retaliation, supporting officers who report misconduct, and improving the field training program to ensure that officers develop the necessary technical and practical skills required to use force in a lawful and effective manner. Internal and civilian complaint investigations, including measures to eliminate arbitrary deadlines for the submission of civilian complaints, standards for conducting objective, thorough, and timely investigations, steps to ensure that the disciplinary system is fair and consistent, and protocols to protect officers' rights against self-incrimination. Staffing and supervision, including completing a staffing and resource study to determine the appropriate allocation of resources, holding supervisors accountable for close and effective supervision, and providing guidance on the effective use of on-body recording systems to promote accountability and strengthen public trust. Recruitment and promotions, including developing a strategic recruitment plan that includes clear goals, objectives, and action steps for attracting qualified applicants from a broad cross-section of the community and ensuring that fair and consistent promotion practices are implemented. Officer assistance and support, including measures to ensure that APD personnel have ready access to mental health services and that supervisors are trained in making referrals in a manner that minimizes stigma, and community engagement and oversight, including measures to strengthen the city's civilian oversight process, public information programs that keep members of the public informed of APD's progress toward reform, requirements on fostering community policing at all levels of APD, and establishing community policing councils throughout the city to ensure that meaningful feedback is obtained from the community.
Now, with all of that said, you might think some things would start to improve at the notorious Albuquerque Police Department, and that has not been the case from everything that I've heard. I think many residents would say that police brutality is continuing despite federal oversight, and that not much has changed. And Rachel, in fact, The Guardian did a report this year in May of 2021, and they had some interesting statistics on just the post-consent decree period alone.
Yes. Since 2015, police in the Albuquerque metro area have shot 44 people, 42 of whom have died. Among cities with more than 500,000 people, Albuquerque has had among the highest rates of fatal police shootings since 2015. As a side note, only Las Vegas was higher, and the state of New Mexico overall trails only Alaska in per capita killings by police.
So, concluding thoughts here, Rachel, on the 1971 rebellion in June of 1971 in Albuquerque 50 years ago, as well as the situation today.
Well, I think it's really important to put this event in context. I think Chicano Latino riots aren't really heard about. I found a Latino USA article that kind of puts this into perspective. So Albuquerque was just one of at least 14 Latino riots that year, but these events are relatively obscure compared to other riots like black versus white riots. And quoting from this article, preserving this history is crucial because the issues that sparked them, such as municipal neglect, discrimination, and poverty, still exist in many communities around the country, as we have pointed out. Sadly, American political culture portrays Latinos as recent arrivals, which makes it appear that these issues are temporary. And this is definitely true of Albuquerque, where they were there first and then they got pushed out by this wave of Anglo immigration, kind of turning that narrative on its head. The Latino community has been in the Southwest for centuries, and it's only relatively recently that they have been kind of pushed to the minority and marginalized. And I think it also brings up an interesting point. they don't really fit this neat binary that is kind of the prevailing paradigm of racial discourse. So I think they do get ignored somewhat in broader discussions of racial or civil unrest.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Rachel, thank you for being on this week to talk about the 50th anniversary of the June 1971 Albuquerque Rebellion at Roosevelt Park.
Thanks for having me.